Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The Chinese and U.S. delegations have concluded their latest trade talks in Spain. According to the China International Trade Representative, the two sides engaged in candid, in-depth, and constructive communication based on mutual respect and equal consultation, and reached a basic framework consensus on resolving issues related to TikTok. So, how did the talks go? What can we take away from the statements afterwards? Can we expect more deals in the next stage? Join us for a discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Zhong Shi, in for Xu Qingduo. First, to meet my panel today, they are Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics, Benjamin Norton, founder and editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report, Radhika Desai, director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, and Max Wolff, CEO of Systematic Ventures. Welcome to our program today. Everyone, why don't we first take a quick recap of what the three previous rounds have brought us leading up to this time in Madrid. Benjamin, do you mind if I start with you? Since May this year, China and the U.S. have held 3 rounds of trade talks in Geneva, London, and Stockholm within just 3 months in an effort to try to cool trade tensions, which began in April with the Liberation Day tariffs issued by U.S. President Donald Trump. On June the 5th, the two presidents also held a phone call, which provided more strategic guidance to the course of dialogue and bilateral relations. Benjamin, overall, how would you assess the current state of the talks?
Well, it seems like progress is being made, which is always a good sign. We want to decrease tensions, of course. But I have to say that, Trump has proven to be so chaotic and inconsistent that it's hard to be very hopeful. I think the Chinese side has been very professional and very serious about coming to an agreement and bringing down the tensions. But we've seen that part of Trump's strategy is to be unpredictable. It's kind of the madman theory. We saw a recent example of this with Europe, in fact, where Trump, he claimed that he and the EU came to an agreement in which the U.S. would put 15% tariffs on European exports. But now there are reports that Trump is claiming that previous tariffs that he imposed of 50% on aluminum and steel also apply to Europe's exports of metallic products, of machinery that include steel and aluminum. So now he's saying that it's 15% plus whatever percent of steel or aluminum are in the European exports to the US. This is one of many examples of how, in English we use the term Trump is moving the goalposts. He says that he came to an agreement, and then when he sees that the other side gave into that agreement, he suddenly changes the terms that were agreed upon. So I will say maybe I'm a bit cautiously optimistic about this breakthrough. But I think in the medium to the long term, it's still going to be a very difficult negotiation process.
Well, the unpredictability of these talks, the unpredictability of what Washington wants and demands certainly has made these talks very difficult. But the very existence of a mechanism between China and U.S. has made it reassuring for many people watching this. Professor Liu, let me get to you now. What do you think has been achieved so far? Are you also cautiously optimistic about the progress?
Yes. I very much agree with our previous guest because the 3 rounds of talks has really de-escalated such a tension from 145% versus 125% tariff. That really makes not only the bilateral economic relationship impossible, but it create a lot more uncertainties around the globe because after all, many of the smaller economies are looking up to the bilateral relationship across the Pacific. So, having said that, the next round of talk, particularly from Madrid, is going to be more and more difficult because some of the emotional type of the negotiation is over. Now both sides are really sitting on a candid approach with more of a rational calculation about each other's interest and also assessment of the other parties' room for concession. And so Trump is really playing a sort of prisoner's dilemma. He first nailed down a number of smaller economies and trying to isolate China so that he can really gather more of the bullets with a more targeted approach. However, China has a firm policy and is very the open principle, but we can really make some of the pragmatic concessions on case-by-case basis and also with reciprocality. But in terms of the principles, China will firmly defend itself, and also China has a lot more bargaining chips on its own hand.
The talks might have gotten more difficult, but if you look at the time it took for both delegations to reach a conclusion, to reach a consensus, whatever you call it, it seems that the time has gotten shorter for both sides to finish that decision making. Radhika, I want to come to you now. What does shorter time tell you about this existing mechanism, this consultation between the two sides, and what do you think topped the discussion this time in Madrid in particular?
Well, I would say that the shorter time is simply a result of the fact that the two sides are now used to one another. But I just want to go back to what some of the previous speakers have said. I mean, while I agree with Ben that one should take a cautiously optimistic position, I think that the caution has to be attributed all to the United States, whereas the optimism to China. That is to say, China has taken a very difficult situation that arises not just because of Trump, but because of the larger problems, the deeper problems within the United States, which led to the election of Trump in the first place. So that's the first point I want to make. The second thing is that the chaos which has resulted is not just a question of Trump's temperament. It is a structural situation in which Trump has promised the American people to revive the US economy by imposing tariffs, while at the same time, the very tariffs that he wants to impose are actually very bad for both the US economy and for the world, but particularly for the US economy. They are already leading to inflation and so on. So, in a certain sense, whatever has been achieved has largely been achieved because Trump's ideas about tariffs were not very good in the first place. So I think that that's something else one should remember. Now, as far as what has been achieved, now obviously the worst has been avoided. 145% tariffs are not being applied, but at the same, and we are being told, of course, in the most recent round that there has been some sort of framework agreement on TikTok. We'll have to wait and see how it all evolves. I think that one of the things that the whole world is learning, and I'm sure China is also learning, is essentially that there is a certain way of handling Trump. So, a lot of the other so-called deals that have come up, European Union, Japan, South Korea, etc., they have all made deals, but there has been nothing in writing. And now they are getting very bad surprises. So Trump has apparently turned around and said to Japan that not only must you invest, whatever it is, $500 billion, but you will invest your $500 billion where I tell you to invest. So all of these shocks are there. There are many tensions within the China-U.S. relationship as well. For example, there is the issue of the chips and the import-export restriction, etc., the rare earths issue, the soybeans issue. So many problems remain. I think China is simply doing the best job it can of not disturbing things too much. I mean, not allowing Trump to disturb things too much. And I think there it has many successes to be proud of.
Max, let me bring you into the conversation here. Both delegations have called this round of talks extensive, wide-ranging. The two sides discussed many issues such as the U.S. tariff measures, the abuse of export controls, and of course, TikTok. Which one of these issues stood out for you in this latest round?
The TikTok issue is a big one for the president because there's a real focus on the influence of the present government on media. And this remains an area that they think they need to sort of button up. And I think they sort of identify, I'm not really sure how correctly TikTok is a bit of a hole in that strategy. What I would say, and even from my, prestigious colleagues here at the roundtable with whom I agree on many things, that the United States doesn't actually have a trade policy. Right? We have a rule of man, not a rule of rules, and that makes it very hard to sit down and have a conversation with a somewhat mercurial individual who's making these policies based not on experience or national trade policy, but based on his ideas, thoughts, hopes, And also increasingly as he turns to the people he said he didn't need, who were his foes, and asks them to bail out the rapidly weakening macro circumstance in the United States while also denouncing. And that's kind of why, historically, at least for the last 70 years or so, we've really tried to work toward and have a rule of rules, a rule of laws, a rule of agreements, as opposed to a rule of individuals, because individuals are mercurial. I don't think this individual has some strategy to be mercurial. I think it might be in the nature and personality of the sort of situation of the moment and maybe his personality. But I think it's hard to accommodate a rules-based structure with someone who doesn't function on rules-based rails. So I think I would be a bit optimistic, but I think as long as there aren't rules, but more whims of men making these decisions, you have to be very optimistic and a little bit unfamiliar with the history of trade negotiations over the last couple hundred years to let yourself become fully optimistic.
Well, let's spend some time with the TikTok topic. Benjamin, how did TikTok and why did it make its way into the trade talks this time? And what does a framework consensus mean for both sides at this point?
Yeah, well, this is a very important issue in the US because TikTok has become one of the most popular social media platforms. And let's not forget that in his first term as US president, Trump, in fact, tried to ban TikTok unsuccessfully. He was blocked by the courts. And then Biden came in and he did successfully ban TikTok for one day, which was also politically a disastrous move because then Trump, for his own partisan reasons, to win support from young voters, Trump portrayed himself as the grand defender of TikTok after he tried to ban it in his first term. So that was a disastrous move by Biden and the Democrats. And then when Trump came in, he still put the pressure on to try to ban TikTok. But the condition for not banning TikTok was that TikTok could be sold to a US tech company and or American investors. Now, we don't know the exact details about this agreement that was signed or that it was allegedly agreed to in Spain. Again, some of this stuff hasn't been in writing yet, but according to the Financial Times, again, this hasn't been officially confirmed, the Chinese parent company of TikTok, presumably ByteDance, will still keep its control over the algorithm, and that TikTok in the US will be operated by an American affiliate that will not own the algorithm. That's according to the Financial Times. Assuming that report is accurate, this would actually be a major win for the Chinese parent company, because what the US wanted was control over the algorithm, because what the US, US governments constantly talk about the importance of competition, but in reality, if you look at how politics works in Washington and in Silicon Valley, they actually don't want competition. They want these big tech companies, especially these social media platforms, to be completely dominant around the entire world. And China has a policy of digital sovereignty, protecting its own, its internet sovereignty, making sure that these platforms must abide by domestic law. Many U.S. companies have refused to abide by Chinese law, which is why they were restricted. So we see that there's this very hypocritical narrative in the U.S. The U.S. government has long attacked China for restricting some of these companies, but now the U.S. government is restricting all of these foreign companies and trying to make sure that only U.S. tech companies dominate. So assuming this reporting is accurate, it seems to be a major win for China being able to protect its own algorithm and prevent the U.S. from taking control of all of these algorithms.
Professor Liu, for now, we know that a framework consensus has been reached pending further instructions from the leaders of both countries and also their domestic respective approval process. Neither side has elaborated on what goes into that framework and what it entails. Can you shed light on what that framework might look like? Does it mean that the U.S. will have more control over the U.S. operation of TikTok concerning user data, security, storage?
Well, strategically, China and actually many other countries would really take a longer term approach because after all, Trump can serve no more than like 3 years roughly. So therefore, the economic interdependence between US and China and many other major economies will be there. So nobody can really dramatically interrupt that whole thing. And now with these rounds of talks over there, So at least it shows that both sides do need each other. And many of those talks are really initiated by the United States. So China remains rather firm. And then after the removal of those the emotional type of retaliation versus counter retaliation, etc. So now it comes down to a bare fact that whether the U.S. tariff will work for the U.S. interest. And then, what would be a defined national security rather than simply political rhetorics. So in that way, so China can read it very clearly and remain rather calm. So we can really make some of the compromises on some strategic issues and also on a technical issue, for example, by releasing the rare earths. But it must be really reciprocated by the same manner by the lifting restrictions on some of the high-tech stuff, from chips to equipment, etc. And then, so over the next few months, particularly now after the second round of extension, we could expect another round, 90 days or even half a year extension of truce, because we do read that even the U.S. White House and its cabinet won't be able to read clearly what is really in the full benefit and what is possibly to be achieved. So both sides need time to really to digest and also to read a truer picture of what is going on. And now the U.S. is also trying to maneuver the Europeans to take a secondary, the tariff over China, which I think is very unlikely. So a number of the gestures are there to more of pacify its own domestic political constituencies rather than really to go for something of a sweeping or comprehensive agreement.
Max, still on the topic of TikTok, according to the Chinese delegation, the consensus was made possible because both sides realized that it was in both of their interests to have this framework consensus. What is your understanding of this was in both the U.S. and China's interests?
So there is a place where both parties can get a lot of what they want, particularly if the U.S. isn't concerned that it's presently making the argument it has made the opposite side of everywhere else in the world, as its U.S. tech companies operate there. So it's a bit uncomfortable to tell the world to trust American social networks because they will be good handlers of other folks' data, and then say no one else will be good handlers of our data is tricky, right? So it does create a particular rhetorical and international trade challenge. To the extent that's well understood by the American team, that's not clear, but so that's an issue. I think there's just another big issue here is that the president has possibly gotten where he is because he has improved his relationships with the social media companies that are major shapers of American opinions and news. And I think he wants an ally and loyal friend, like he's got at CBS now or CNN now, so big news agencies, probably wants someone like that inside TikTok. And so you have to backfit national security and trade interest into that agenda, which is tricky. On the flip side, I think it's important that the Chinese retain sovereign control over algorithms and data practices. This is an argument we've made all over the world for decades, and it actually does make some technical sense, right? So I understand why folks make it. It's not a crazy argument. So yeah, I think you just have, I think both governments have interest in the optics to their populations and to the world, and those interests are both for a deal, but also not to be seen as losing in this, whatever that means exactly. And so I think the optics are as important for the U.S. or more important than they've ever been before, and the rules are less important than they've been before. And so that's a little bit confounding for a world that's negotiated with an America defined historically by more interest in the rules, less interest in the optics. So I think that remains a challenge, and this is a hot point because there's nothing more public than the news systems and the public data.
Radhika, what are your thoughts on the optics of it all, the optics of a deal around TikTok finally the consensus, the framework consensus of it at least, finally being agreed to by both sides?
Well, we don't know the details, the concrete details yet, so we will find out. But the optics are, I would say, all important as far as Trump is concerned. I mean, as far as China is concerned, as everybody has said, its main interest is in retaining possession of the algorithms and other such technological knowledge, while conceding to some extent, giving a face-saving concession to route the traffic via Texas or whatever it is, via Oracle and so on. But for Trump, the optics are most important. So Trump always wants to make it look like he has won something, that other people have bowed to him. And this, by the way, is going to make things very difficult, because if there's one thing that the Chinese are very wary of doing, is looking as though they are bowing to Trump. But that's what Trump needs. And this is partly why there have been such difficulties in a certain sense. There have been rounds and rounds of negotiations, and while the worst has been avoided, it's not like there isn't a plethora of issues that still remain to be resolved, and new issues will come up. So we will see how it goes. I would like to see the details of the agreement, because there is this clash between Trump's need, I would say. It is his political need. It's not just, again, a question of his narcissistic personality, which is, of course, there plentifully, but the fact that politically he needs to sell it to the American people that I have won something, I have made the Chinese bow, etc., etc. And this is not going to end well for Trump.
What about the issue of tariffs? Everyone, I want to get your thoughts on this also, because this trade consultation mechanism was created to address the tariff conflict between the two sides. And one major point of attention before this round was whether the two sides could move beyond the current tariff pause, find a mutually acceptable tariff arrangement, and work toward a more stable trade agreement. Benjamin, it didn't seem that tariff got a lot of mention this time in Madrid.
Yeah, I think Radhika is absolutely right that what Trump is thinking right now is that he wants to portray this as a victory to the American people and say, I saved TikTok. TikTok is now going to be American, which is questionable. I mean, that's not really true, but he can use that narrative to portray it as a victory. In terms of the tariffs, I think this is going to be a much more difficult process of negotiation. And like I said, Trump's strategy has been to move the goalposts, to say that he came to an agreement, to bully one side, and then when they sign some kind of agreement, whether or not it's written or whether it's oral, they come to an agreement, and then Trump suddenly changes the terms. Now, China is not going to allow this. The U.S. forced its so-called allies to come to these agreements that are very one-sided, like the European Union, like Japan, like South Korea. China is, of course, much more independent. It has always strongly defended its sovereignty. And in the case of the European Union, I have to say that Sabina Weyand, who's the European Commission negotiator, the chief of trade, she acknowledged in an interview that there were no negotiations, as she put it. And the reason she said there were no negotiations is because that Europe is dependent on the U.S., especially in terms of its military support from the U.S. So that was a top official from Europe acknowledging that there was not really a process of negotiation, that the U.S. dictated the terms, and the Europeans were forced to agree to those terms. Obviously, China is not going to agree to that. China is going to defend its interests, and that's why this process has been much longer. It's going to continue, I think, for several months. It's going to be more complicated, and Trump thinks that he can simply threaten China and come to some easy victory like he did to Europe, and that is absolutely not going to happen with China.
Max, what do you think of this? How will tariffs be featured in the upcoming trade talks now? Have the low-lying fruits been picked already? And the current level of tariffs between the two sides is likely to remain for some time.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to be optimistic, the idea is that the Chinese negotiators will allow a plausible pathway for a declaration of victory vis-a-vis TikTok, and then win the actual tariff war by getting the concessions with the other 99% of the macroeconomy, which is not an altogether bad strategy. So I would understand that. I think the issue, and I don't mean to repeat, but the issue here is it isn't 100% clear what you get from an agreement. I think that issue is, for instance, top of mind in NATO right now. What does an agreement mean? And so if it's very difficult to get an agreement, if there's an absence of publicly disclosed written detail, and then there's a repeated retrading on the agreement, sometimes a few days later, if the public understanding of the agreement is bad for you, you change it. It's hard to know what it means for an agreement that is very difficult to strike, very optics driven, and then sometimes very quickly abandoned unceremoniously. And I think we have referenced the European trade negotiations. And I think if you're sitting in Europe now, what you gave up is fairly clear. What you got is very, very unclear and not in an altogether great way. And so I think, again, rule of law is different than rule of man. Rule of man floats with the man. Rule of law floats with adherence to law. So I think that from what I can tell, the Chinese negotiators figured that out. And if they didn't, they watched the Canadian experience, they watched the South Korean experience, watched the European experience. And a pattern that repeats 100% of the time is fairly easy to identify with lesser minds on the job than the Chinese are presently deploying.
Professor Liu, as unpredictable as it is to pinpoint the direction of these trade talks in the future, and as hard as agreements might come by between the two sides, can I have you look into the future and tell us where are those trade negotiations are headed next?
Yes, if we look at the agreements, the first phase agreement signed during his first administration in the White House, there could be predictable second or third phase agreement. But now in his new term, he totally overthrew that whole thing. So therefore, the sweeping comprehensive agreement is unlikely. But both sides may likely to achieve something on a technical basis, for example, to build a joint committee or a joint cohort to work on specific sectors. And the success story is that the joint work group towards the control of fentanyl has really achieved a great deal. And next we can really build some more of those sectorial type of joint discussion instead of a whole blanket of talks over the tariff, to address climate change issues, to address the specific sectors like the lifting of the restriction of certain quote-unquote sensitive technologies and products, and also to release the rare earth issues, etc. So we are still there on the right track to continue to engage with each other, but we have to lower our expectation on a sweeping agreement, but let's deal on a piecemeal, case-by-case, and also progressive approach.
Well, guys, we're running out of time here on the broadcast. My heartfelt thanks to all of you. Thank you so much for your great insight, your time, and your expertise. Frictions might be inevitable, but the very existence of this consultation mechanism shows that both China and the U.S. value sitting down, communicating, and getting that consensus. And this latest round in Spain shows that consensus is possible, navigating through frictions. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. You can find more content of the program on the CGTN app or on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Zhong Shi. See you next time.